Hello, everybody. This is Christine West, and thank you for joining us, the Emotional Dilemma podcast. And I'm so excited to have my guest today, Jaymie Herbert, who I recently met, and I loved our conversation. And I found her to be such an interesting person, an interesting guest, that I wanted our conversation to continue today because she has an awesome background, has overcome such huge hurdles that many probably have not experienced, but she's functioning and she's living and she's doing some great things in the world. So I just wanted to bring her on and thank you, Jaymie, for being here. So please say hello to our audience.
Hello. Thank you so much, Christine, for having me on the podcast. I'm really excited.
Well, yay, thank you. And I'm going to disclose to anybody's listening, I have construction in my background. So if you hear all these weird noises, we're just going to go with it because I'm somebody that things happen and I work out of my home and this is my studio. So it is what it is. But anyways, Jaymie, when we met, I know today you're in human resources and you work for the city of Wasilla, which is cool, but you had some very humble beginnings.
I did. Yes. I most people wouldn't think that statistically I shouldn't have been where I'm at now, for sure.
And why do you say that?
I grew up in a home with addiction and unfortunately ended up in foster care. And at the age of between 4 and 8, I was in and out. I was eventually adopted at the age of 12 from a home who kind of did it for the financial aspect. They ended up adopting 14 children. And so it was a very emotional, abusive, physically, sexually abusive home. Um, I really jumped into school. School was kind of my safe place. And I just really wanted to try to excel at that. And then I also would sneak out and try to go to church groups. So to really just try to find some level of peace because going home was not a peaceful environment, but I was also on lockdown. So it was kind of how do I figure out how to maneuver through these challenges?
I love what you just said because I'm curious, how were you called to like a church group? I mean, I'm assuming that, I mean, it was a call from God to say, hey, go here. How did you know that at a young age?
Well, what's funny is I lived right above a church,
Oh,
and when I first came into the house, I call it the house because it kind of became the house. It was just
yeah.
like a stigma with it. And, it was right above the church, and I went to Vacation Bible School in the 4th grade when I first came in, and it was a really awesome experience, and I really started to build those relationships with some of the older women.
Yeah.
And eventually, by the time I was in 6th grade, that's kinda when everything shifted. That's when I was adopted, that's when CPS was kind of out of it, and that's when the abuse really started to kick
Mm.
up steam, because there was no checks and balances at that point. All of the kids were, finally adopted, um and the money was flowing. So ultimately, that's when the safeguards kind of got put on place. We were not allowed to go anywhere.
Mhm.
And so I had initially established my church relationship before all of that happened. Um, and we were allowed to go to church. It was kind of one of those. My adopted mother wanted to be religious. She wasn't necessarily religious, but she was very uh, that's how she kind of I wouldn't say manipulated the situation, but she definitely held on to her faith as the why she got into the foster system and kind of went back to it on a normal basis in terms of like punishment. And so going to church was okay. So I would do that. But then if we got too close to friendships or relationships, that's when we would be pulled out of it. So it kind of was a sporadic go to the Bible study as much as I can, but it wasn't allowed a lot either. So I just kind of felt safe there.
Well, thank you for really being open about that because it sounds to me that you were definitely in a narcissistic um, environment where The typical, psychological abuse of where if you got close to somebody that could open your eyes and your heart to, something different, that you may potentially open your mouth or do something different or no longer be obedient to. Yeah.
Mhm.
So how did you, I mean, I love it that you found, a church group, and I can't even imagine, growing up in an environment where, this narcissistic person that is, monetizing off of, a bunch of kids and making sure that you guys are doing what you need to be doing and to stay compliant. So, yeah. So, what was, I mean, is there anything that you'd be willing to share? Like, what was that like?
It was very hard. Um, we had 14 kids, and at some point, she realized that medication usage would increase that stipend, and so she started to bring us into a therapy session once a month, where we would have to sit in front of the psychiatrist and be told how horrible we were, and then we would be diagnosed with I was diagnosed with bipolar at the time. And I was in 7th grade or 8th grade. My siblings all were diagnosed with either ADHD, bipolar, uh, all sorts of different medications were issued. We had a tackle box with medication that we would have to distribute, and I was the distributor of that medication and had to like blow. It's just really weird. Um, but I say all of that because school for me was my safe haven. I was about 2 miles away from school, and we had to walk to school and back even in the rain, which in San Diego, thank goodness it doesn't rain very often.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I had 20 minutes to walk to school, 20 minutes to walk home. If I was gonna be late, I would need a note that said what time I left, why I was there, and what time I had gotten there, just to
Yep.
make sure my time was kinda tracked.
Yep.
And so I wasn't allowed to do any after school activities. I would go to school to and tell her that I needed help with my homework or with my writing, and so I would talk to the teacher and just sit there and talk with him. His name was Mr. Snyder. I then was transferred in high school to a charter school,
Uh-huh.
and I was the first student who was a senior to go to this charter school because they didn't do that. They started at 7th grade to senior year, and that was totally unheard of, that a student would come in their senior year because they prep you for so long. I was behind in credits, so essentially I was always good in school, but it was very challenging. I had to get in at I had to go to bed at 8 o'clock, and I wasn't allowed to. I had all these chores when I got home, so there was really not a lot of time to do homework, um, and so church was kind of in between that. I built those rapport with, my really close, friend, and when I go to San Diego, we stay with my family
Yep.
there, Miss Jean, and she had been such a positive light for me, and just the women there. So I would go there once every month or so to try to just connect too.
That's amazing. And I'm happy that you had that, because your story sounds as though you were Cinderella.
Well, we did wash a lot of baseboards, and we did catch a lot of flies is what we were told to do. So, I mean, that sounds really weird, but in California, there's so many flies that it's
Right, right,
definitely
right. Where you're very restricted,
yeah.
and so having this conditioning, did
Mhm.
you have any insight that there was anything more than what existed for you?
No. I, was only allowed to watch Disney Channel, Nickelodeon, and, Cartoon Network. I didn't watch movies. We were allowed to eat 3 times a day. There was no snacking. no alcohol or any alcohol in the house, so that was always bad. Um, you know, there was a lot of kids that were abused there in general, and so there was a lot of trauma, and it was all under one roof. And then not having um, a mom who really wanted to have, wanted to care about the trauma was hard because, because of the sex abuse that happened even before that and during, uh, that's how it kind of came out. And then you have a bunch of hormones and teenagers. So then sex was bad. And there's just so much of like, as a teenager that we were just wrong for. So when I went into the adult world at 18, because I had the option of going into the military or
Yeah.
failing and being on the street, and I chose to go into the Air Force. And I that first step in on my own was just crazy because I had to learn so many things. I had to learn that it was okay to kiss. I had to learn that it was okay to not be okay. I had to learn that it was, okay for me to say what if I didn't like something, because I didn't have a voice at the house. I didn't have, I had to be okay with eating out of a refrigerator. I was for my first year, it was really trying to, one, deal with the loss of my family because I was disowned.
Uh-huh.
Um, and then two, learn how to be in the world and it be okay because you know, going grocery shopping at that house was like a privilege. It was, you could go grocery shopping with us if you're really good. And so you'd be good all week long. And all of a sudden, at the end of the week, everybody's gaining up against everybody. And it was almost like a swarm, and you would be bad. So now you can't go. How dare you? So for the first year of me being in the military, I went grocery shopping every payday just to go grocery shopping because I liked going grocery shopping. And it was like, I could do this. I don't need anybody to tell me no. And I would fill up my refrigerator um in my room. And then what was so worse about it is because I wasn't allowed to eat outside normal eating time at the
Yep.
house, and because my weight was such a huge negative connotation, I couldn't eat out of that fridge. And so I would buy $150 worth of groceries only to turn around and give it away to my friend who was my next door neighbor and then do it all over again because it was just the cycle of feeling okay.
So this is okay. This is fascinating because everybody, most people, do not know what that's like to not know, like to go to the grocery store or open the refrigerator or have this type of, whether it's a fear or an anxiety or conditioning of having that type of restrictions. And I just really applaud you for being open to share and to talk about it, because by doing so, that tells me that you have made some leaps and jumps and leaps and major growth, that to be able to be open and honest and share, because that's, most people can't even fathom that. That's like a movie that we're watching.
Yes. I mean, I've been through years and years of therapy. When I first joined the military, it was such a whirlwind. I was just becoming an adult. I came, I can't, I had to learn how to drive by myself, and my thank goodness for my friend who had his little blue car and could take me at midnight to learn on the Alabama back roads. Like, I had to learn so many things just to kind of become a person. And I bought my first car, and then I got orders to Alaska, and I got my license on a Friday. I went to the car dealership on a Sunday. I got a car, and then I got orders on Monday to Alaska. And so my crazy self was like, I'm driving to Alaska even if I have a license for 6 months. And it was impulsive, it was exhilarating, it was fun, but it taught me a lot. And it therapy has been such a huge thing because it's connected those triggers.
Yep.
And recently, I one of the big things, even going through therapy all these years, I always there's always something that someone with trauma ties back to, whether it be a really bad thing
Yep.
or, maybe something just to disassociate yourself with that trauma, just to
Yep.
get by, to not feel it.
Yep.
And for me, it was I need to do better and I need to prove her wrong. And
Right.
so I almost unhealthily jumped into volunteering and doing school. I was in school full time right out the gate, and I was working and I was doing all of these things. And I, just to not think about it, I couldn't even feel comfortable sitting on the couch by myself at the age of at 20. It was uncomfortable for me to be at home alone on my couch. So because those emotions were there. So in order
Right.
to get past it, I had to just fight through it, but it was unhealthy. And it wasn't until my first marriage when I was 21 and being in an mentally abusive marriage, and feeling myself kind of lost in that. And then 3 months of wanting to commit suicide where I didn't even want to go into work. I was a high performer, but I had a failure in my fitness test because of in the military. It's huge. Um, my marriage seemed to be falling apart. I was drinking without wanting to really drink because in my mind it was bad. So I was going through this whole identity crisis of like, am I going to be okay? Am I okay? Am I good? Am I bad? I'm going to be judged. And then on top of that, not having a family in that moment. Plus, I was still at that point trying to cultivate a relationship with my bio mom and my bio dad, and that was all traumatic. So there was just so many things happening all at once that I was so very thankful when I did finally find a therapist who helped me. But alongside that, I had a mentor. His name is Gary, and he absolutely saved me. I mean, just the fact that I could go in there and completely be unapologetically emotional and
Yep.
cry. I mean, I cried at his retirement ceremony on the couch that he had on. He brought his couch from his office at his ceremony, and I just bawled. I was pregnant, of course, so that didn't help. But I mean, there's just so much. I had to find those people that can kind of help me walk through that. And I don't think I would have been able to get through it without that support because it was a lot.
So this is, I love what you're sharing because your beginnings, I'm just going to say it, or they're not most people's beginnings. I'm not saying other people didn't experience what you experienced, but yet to be in a position where at 18 years old, it's weird for you to go to a grocery store. It's weird to eat out of a refrigerator. It's weird for you to make decisions because you have this conditioning that's so abusive. And but then yet you and I, from what you're sharing, doesn't sound like you really had these knowing who you could trust or not trust, and maybe even know the difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've noticed even over 15 years of healing, I still have a lot of reservation when it comes to trust. It's really easy for me now to disassociate and
Yeah.
disconnect. And if I'm not able to be who I am authentically with somebody and speak the way I speak, or
Yeah.
to get an opinion that I may think I have, and I'm trying to learn the balance of yes, I'm okay with an opinion, or no, that it's not. Because I recently was told not every opinion needs to be heard, but that's a hard thing for me because I never had an opinion. I never was allowed to have one. So to me, it's a trigger, and I'm trying to connect that now because, maybe that not everything needs to be heard, but to me, it's very important to be heard. And even if I'm wrong, those friends that are really, really close to me that I've now created as my family, they'll tell me if I'm wrong. They'll be open and communicative, and I appreciate that because not only am I allowed to be unapologetically myself, but I also have those people to tell me, Jaymie, that wasn't kind, or the way
Mm.
you said that wasn't kind. Because I really am 10 or 15 years behind the normal curve because I didn't get to develop relationships and learn how to speak in social settings and learn how to maneuver life situations and know when those boundaries are crossed. Like, I feel like I really have had to start to learn those. And every time I think I learn them, then something else happens. And I'm like, okay, well, maybe I need to regravitate. And it's just been a crazy learning opportunity and journey for me.
But here's something, Jaymie, I'll share with you that, and thank you for being authentically you. And there's nothing to apologize for. Is that even people that did not grow up in your settings have those challenges too. Maybe not with the grocery store eating out of the refrigerator, but as far as not knowing who they authentically are, and having the challenge between, knowing if they're right or wrong, or blurting things out, or being connected to their emotions. It's so you're not alone. So everybody has their story, but what's so unique about yours is most people take for granted or don't even think about it. You just have a refrigerator in the apartment or the house and you open it up, or you go through a drive-through, or what's today, DoorDash, or you go to a restaurant. But the one thing I want to ask you is, how did so when you made the decision to go in the military, and then you shared, then you end up getting married. Did you meet your husband at that time in the military or elsewhere, or?
Yes, my husband at the time, him and I met right before I went to Alaska.
Okay.
And I was at that point, I was 20. I was 20. And I really just wanted connection. Um, I lost my family at that
Yep.
point. I only cried 2 times at basic training. The first time was when my adopted mother, I called her on Mother's Day, and she told me that she was not coming to
Mm-hmm.
my graduation. And then on graduation day, when I was the only person that was alone. And at that point, it felt like the end of the world. And it was the same year of me meeting my ex-husband.
Okay.
And I hadn't started therapy at that point, and I didn't really understand all the emotions. I just remember feeling dejected and woe is me, but not really wanting to stay there. I had siblings calling me because they were all wanting to uh, tell me how horrible I was. And so there was a lot of power play going on.
Yep.
And I just wanted connection. And I got that. I got that from my ex husband at that time. And we talked over the phone, and it was long distance
Yep.
because I moved to Alaska. And I thought everything was great and wonderful. And then when he moved up here, it just felt like I couldn't do anything correctly, and that there was just something to be said. And he wanted to talk about emotions. I didn't like emotions. I didn't really care. I found myself researching things just to have a conversation, but I just wanted to be, again, just there in the world. Like, I didn't really care. I was in this like weird state of mind where I was young minded in terms
Yep.
of my experience, but I was also trying to avoid things. So there was just this like, it, I mostly airheadedness is the only word I
Okay.
could think of, because I was just wanting to be oblivious. I didn't want to truly see anything on a deeper level. It was not something that I was looking towards.
So really, what your marriage was a recreation of what you already were used to on some
Yes.
levels.
And I
And so,
allowed it.
yeah, but a lot of people need to hear that, because when we get very comfortable with stuff, no
Mhm.
matter good or bad, or whether it's attractive or not,
Mhm.
we to resolve it, part of the healing journey is to recreate it, to make different decisions.
Mhm. Oh, yeah. And
Yeah.
I definitely found that, and he put me in a lot of uncomfortable situations that I just allowed, and I kept allowing it because I wanted to
Yep.
fit in and I wanted to
Yep.
be a good wife. And
Yep.
thankfully, I still had the balance of going to school and being a high performer and still needing to do that. But what it caused was a conflict of what my mental state was. Was I okay with these? Was I okay with where I was at? And it really had me questioning everything. It had me questioning life. It had me questioning whether this was okay. Am I okay? And some of that probably was from the childhood and always hearing how alcohol was bad. And so for me, to drink was bad, but I was doing it. So there was like a lot of emotional dilemma going on
Yep.
internally. And I was allowing him to tell me how I wasn't being a good wife. And I would allow him to come and tell me, I'm going to leave for a weekend to think about whether I want to be with you. And then that was back on me, and I was the bad one. And it was just very turmoilous, just very finger pointing. And I allowed it and I accepted it because I was bad. And it was just very hurtful. But I was also going to therapy, thank goodness.
So okay, a couple of questions. How did you make a decision to go to therapy? How did you, since you said that you didn't like emotions, which I understand because at one time I didn't like emotions either. I didn't either. So, I mean, why talk about them? Why deal with them? So, how did you know that to do that?
Um, well, my ex-husband had 2 moms that were both therapists. So if he
Okay.
did anything to me, it was that he had 2 moms that were therapists, and then he ended up choosing the mental health field as well in the
Okay.
military. And because he was in the mental health field, I could actually go off base, which isn't normal for a military member.
Yep.
And so what ended up happening was I was on the couch with Mr. Smith all the time. I was crying
Yep.
every day. It seemed like I wasn't keeping it together, but I was still doing a good job at my work, but I
Okay.
still was not keeping it together very well. And every time I had to sit on that stinking couch. And I just remember driving into work about 3 months after consistently crying on a regular basis and wanting to commit, like wanting to go off the road. And I did that for about 2 or 3 weeks where I just kept having this vision of me just going off the road. And at that point, I had heard enough about, therapy and, you need to talk about your emotions and you don't do this and you don't do that for my ex husband. I was like, well, screw this. Like, maybe I need to see a
Mhm.
therapist just so that I could shut him up.
Okay.
And so that's really kind of where it stemmed from. But 3 months of wanting to do something really not, really not good, um, pushed me there, but also him being just pestering and
Okay.
that I wasn't normal, and I was like, "I'll prove you wrong, I'll be normal, that's normal, okay." And so I met my therapist, Karen, at that point, and I I don't know if I felt comfortable, but I also was weird because in the beginning of my journey, I was very vocal about my childhood. I shared it with too many people is what I was told, and it was normal for me to talk about my trauma and I was like, "Whatever, like, this is me, and I'm gonna be loud, and I'm gonna be boisterous," and I until someone told me, "Jaymie, you probably shouldn't share that. That's kind of a little weird," but, so it's never been hard to talk about my story, but I love that I could talk about my story and connect it with healing now. That's one big piece that I love. Um,
Congratulations.
Thank you. But that's why I chose therapy. My ex-husband was annoying and I was not in a good spot and knew I needed something else at that point.
So did therapy help you to make the decision to say that he's no longer good for you, a good fit?
Uh kind of sort of no. I kind of yes and no. One, it was helping me be able to connect the triggers. So that piece in of itself was better. That was helpful. But the biggest piece I think for me to leave that relationship is we had a split, and I had in the military we have something called a DEROS here, and that tells us how long we're going to be in Alaska. And so I decided at that point he had come up a year later, so I needed to match my time with his. And we split for the summer, and I was okay. I felt okay. I stayed with a friend and I felt okay. And I moved I moved everything by myself. I did all of this work. And then we got back together in the fall. And in the fall, I found an apartment that I knew I could pay for on my own. I didn't know if I wanted to be with him, but at that point I figured, well, maybe it'll work out. It's my marriage. I need to work it out. And it wasn't until we moved back in that I don't know if the dots were connecting or if I was starting to value myself more. I can't really put a point on it, but I just remember being at a fancy dinner one night, and we went out to dinner, and I had told him he looked nice. I was giving him all the compliments, and he made a comment at dinner. I said, well, actually, I asked him, why haven't you given me a feedback, like any compliments? Why, I feel pretty. Why wouldn't you do that for me? And he said, his exact words were, well, 80% I don't like you, and 30% I don't like the way you look, or something to the effect
Okay.
of percentages. And it was at that moment, again, I was okay with being alone through the summer. We got back together, and I noticed a shift in my behavior at that point and how I was reserved. And
Mhm.
so when he made that comment, it was like, I don't need this anymore. Like, I don't need you. I don't need this relationship. I'm okay with being alone. I don't want this. I don't want to feel this way. And so I just remember looking at him and said, well, I really think that we should get a divorce. And I said it so calmly. It was almost like this realization, and it wasn't anger, it wasn't sadness.
Mhm.
It was just being okay. And he looked at me like shocked, like, oh, I'm so glad we could have this conversation in a very positive manner. And that's how he said it. And I was like, you're a very condescending prick, like, but whatever. And so at that moment, I was like, okay, cool. Well, the next day, it was like this weight was lifted off of me. And I was like, I'm my person. I'm going to go and I'm going to have fun, and I'm going to go and do what I normally would do as myself. And he hated that. He hated it so much. He was like, he was sleeping on the couch and I was in the bedroom, and we were in this one bedroom apartment, and he was like, oh, and I'm like, what's wrong with you? Why are you so unhappy? This is, I thought, what you wanted. And he was like, well, I don't understand why you can't be like this with me. And I'm like, well, that's a you problem, not a me problem. And because you don't make me happy. Like, I don't know what else to tell you except that. So,
So it sounds like you, in this moment, you found yourself. You found
mhm,
a version of yourself that you were okay. All of a
mhm,
sudden saying, I can be with me. I can deal with
mhm,
myself. I can
right.
open the refrigerator. I can, I can do,
And at this
I
point,
can, yeah.
I would make baked goods and still couldn't taste test my food because I couldn't do it. It was just like I could eat out of my fridge, but I couldn't taste test my desserts. It was so weird.
Yeah, this is, I just love your openness, because one of the things that I really want that you said that's so important is because there's these like weird rules that people say, things such as, no, you shouldn't be talking about you're oversharing, you're telling too much about your story about how you grew up.
Mhm.
Well, are we supposed to sugarcoat everything? Because that's your
Right?
story. It's part of your journey. It's part of the
Mhm.
reason why you make decisions. It's the reason why, how you see the world,
Mhm.
and why you do what you do,
Mhm.
and part of your healing journey. And are we supposed to go around saying to people, nope, my life was great, I grew up in foster care, and and then I got into this weird situation, adopted, and it wasn't a hunky dory, and that's it. And now you want to know why I can't open the refrigerator? you know,
Exactly.
so I say that, and I know that I'm making lightheartedness right now out of it. And I'm happy that you're okay with it. But it's interesting because why is that? From my view, it's where you came from.
Mhm. I think a
And
lot of people are not okay with talking about uncomfortable things.
agreed, agreed,
I mean,
agreed.
I see it in HR all the time. I mean, people
Yeah,
just inherently don't wanna be connected to that. If it's uncomfortable, then it may not be uncomfortable for one person, but it may be comfortable for another. It's kind of like, it's like a spectrum. You never know what you could talk about until you know the person. Um, but I think it's super important because we don't hear enough success stories, and you have to talk about the difficult to be able to create a community of strong individuals.
right. Because that's all where, when we met, what was gave me such a joy, because like you, because knowing you work in HR, and we'll get to like how you got there, but part of learning how to have difficult conversations, and it doesn't mean that everybody is like, you don't know what you're uncomfortable with until you get that little trigger inside of you, and then you make that decision how to handle it. But if we're constantly in that space of saying, I'm uncomfortable, so you're wrong, and we can't talk about it, we don't build community. We don't, and we end up wronging people, and then people who feel something differently than us, or have advanced or grown into a place where, hey, we need to talk about, the elephant in the room. The pile that's swept under the rug is getting a little bit too high, and the rug is too small for all the crap.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about, I guess, my journey in terms of going into the HR field, in the military, I was in the middle. So there was really no place with me to be able to bring anything to light without it ruffling feathers, because it wasn't my place. So
Right?
now going into the role that I'm at now, I have the ability to kind of almost force those conversations to say, hey, I'm hearing two different things from two different people. Let's all get at the table. We'll talk about it, and we'll all get on the same page.
Yep.
And what I'm realizing, because when we started, we have a lot of new people, but there was a
Yep.
lot of islands, and it was because of communication. And
Right.
communication overall is hard, especially when it's 10 years of, or 15 or 20 years of just um, emotions that are high, and
Yep.
frustration and all of that. And sometimes you just have to cut it with a knife. And
Yeah.
that's unfortunate. It has to happen that way. But what I'm seeing is I'm seeing openness start to happen. It's taken us almost 3 years to start to see that, like, okay, maybe it's not a bad thing. But I feel like my emotional intelligence side, by doing 10 years of therapy, has been super helpful in my role, because now I could relate over to the other person, and I can
Beautiful.
ask those questions to kind of get them to think. And it's their job to think. It's not my job. My
Well,
job is just to get that moving.
bingo, because part of emotional intelligence, now we're talking about one of my favorite topics in the world, is that that's something that many need to realize, is that being intelligent with your emotions is, and then let's just speak of, say, empathy. I mean, empathy, is more of like seeing where somebody's at to understand where they're at.
Mm-hmm.
And that assertion is more to, and then emotional expression is more to assert oneself, and expression to, like as you said, get something moving. But
Mm-hmm.
it's not your job to step over the boundary to say, I'm going to do everything for you.
Mm-hmm.
It's more of, hey, you know what, I gave you what you need. Okay, you got to do your part too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that is so important in any. Uh, we enable victimization a lot in
Yeah.
our community.
Yep.
I feel like, at least,
We
and
do. We do.
I've never really felt that victim mentality until actually 2 weeks ago, is when I really sat in an emotion that I haven't allowed myself to sit in, that I am a victim. I have lived through a significant amount of trauma, and that was it's painful. It's painful to sit with. And now I'm in a whole nother level of journey to figure out, okay, why didn't I sit in that? And I mean, I already know why, but now to understand that loneliness a little bit better, I could understand how somebody could stay in that place if they don't have the, uh, the tether to kind of hold them in place. And so I don't blame people with that mentality, because there is a lot of loneliness with it, a lot of going through that.
Well, I think also, there's an old mentality that is starting to break in the workplace, of things such as the mentality of, let's leave your emotions at the door,
Mm-hmm.
or not going to talk about anything that's uncomfortable. You're
Mm-hmm.
just going to be a machine, and you're
Right.
just going to be productive. And it's not about saying things and feeling words.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying that, just for listeners, I'm not saying that work needs to be a therapeutic session.
Mm-hmm.
And as a business psychologist, it's more of from the emotional intelligence perspective,
Mhm.
it's more of, hey, where are you at? So if
Mhm.
you're at a place of something gives you anger,
Mhm.
knowing that you're angry, so that you don't, and it may not have to do with anything to do with the situation, it just has to
Mhm.
do with something in your past.
Mhm. And
And
I'm
that,
not saying that you have to, like, I think it makes you a better manager. If
yeah,
you know and can connect with your people in a
yeah,
way that you now know what they need, or you at least have that
yeah,
conversation. Sometimes I can't give you that, but if I tell them, I've had really difficult conversations overall. And if I have to have those difficult conversations, I get more positive reception of telling them that they can't do something if I'm transparent about that
right.
at the
How
get-go.
about that? Instead of manipulative and playing games.
Exactly.
Yeah. So
Exactly. And that's how I gain that respect. And even, there's been recently, I had a manager make a pretty bold comment about my employee, and I had to address it with my employee because I just wanted to make sure. And I love my employee because she is just the kindest, most understanding, and she really loves the psychological aspect of anything, of people.
cool.
And so it's really cool to work with because that's kind of where I see HR needing to go,
Yep.
in
Me
both,
too.
yeah,
Me
in
too.
terms of both hats. And
Yeah.
so um, it's really awesome to see. So she ended up taking um, my statement and realizing where she was at, and then calling the person and saying, hey, I just wanted to let you understand where I was coming from, and then talked about it a little bit further. Well, in that conversation, I got a message back saying, why, essentially, why did you talk to that individual about this? And I said, well, I'm sorry that you feel like that. I essentially said, I'm sorry that you feel like I betrayed or spoke openly, but she's my employee and deserves to have that input, because that is how she's going to become a better person and a better employee and a better individual. So you
Good
would do the
on
same
you.
thing to your person, like it just, and so I had to like put that back into perspective.
Well, these old, mentalities,
Mhm.
they don't work. And something I recently read from one of my peers in the IO psychology field wrote a article on how the HR manager is going to be the IO psychologist moving into the future. And I bring that up because HR, I mean, human resources,
Mhm.
but yet so many human resource departments are pushing processes in paper.
But if you think about it, that's kind of where companies put them too.
Yeah.
Because companies don't, you have the C-suite. And I was just recently at an HR conference, and what's so unfortunate is that our field hears all of this in our briefings, and we're so excited and we're ready to bring it back to the force. But with a C-suite that doesn't support HR to be at the table, or doesn't support the human resources aspect, because it is
Yeah.
our job to understand the human aspect of an
Yeah.
organization and then help lead that organizational shift. That is the role of HR, because I have the managers in my office. I have those employees coming to me with concerns. I hear all of that. And at the C-suite level, their role is to make sure the operations are going. My role is to help manage those people to be able to help the mission keep going, the
Well,
operations.
see, this is what I think, and I just want to run this past you.
Mhm.
I I'm not saying that sounds attractive how you grew up. It doesn't sound attractive, but it sounds like you got some good training to work through your own self, to find yourself,
Mhm.
to know what doesn't work and not to re-experience it, and to bring into the HR arena, and especially that you work in an a muni in a city that which is can be political, of really being able to, once you found yourself, to say, you know what, I just got to put it out there. This is how I see it, and I'm going to, share.
Yeah, when I started 3 years ago, almost 2.5 years ago, it was an administrative role. It was a pass-through that I feel really, really extremely bad for the previous HR people. They were stuck in a corner,
Yeah.
and I still have moments where I'm like, "Gosh, this should not be this complicated." Um, but what I'm trying to do is take those pieces by pieces, and I'm so used I say it all the time. In government, it's 10 years behind. In Alaska government, we're 20 years behind. It's just kind of the way it is. But um, they hired me from a military standpoint, from the military, thinking at that point, who was hiring me I didn't know anything. I couldn't really, I would conform, right? That's they could teach me to conform, and the military tells me enough, and then on top of my background in my childhood, there's enough negative, like, "No, you can't," that I was like, "Okay, well, how can I?" I don't like to hear "I can't" unless it's absolute, and if you're telling me I can't, there has to be a reason why, so that I could truly understand, because more than likely than not, you could get to a yes, it just is gonna take a little longer to get there.
I love this because it shows the work you've done on yourself.
Mhm. Yeah.
It really does. And I'm so proud of you.
Oh, thank you.
I am because there's so many people still stuck and don't have the background you have.
Well, I will say the one thing that's kinda helped me even get some remotely out of a mental institution situation, um, it really has been really trying to figure out when I need that re establishment of care, and, um, I've reestablished care about 4 or 5 times, and for all different situations, I'll be okay, and everything's okay, and then all of a sudden a life situation happens. After I had my son, I had really bad postpartum, I had a hard time connecting, so I went back. When I had my daughter, it brought a whole 'nother layer of emotions because she looked like me. I mean, there's been times where I knew in that moment I couldn't handle it on my own, and so I needed to really go back to my roots, and it wasn't long term. Recently, I was diagnosed with ADHD, and that has been completely life changing. And coming from somebody who was giving out pills in a tackle box, I was always against medication and against the usage of it.
Uh-huh.
And but it's been so relieving. It makes me understand now, you know, that I was overstimulated in so many different ways, and and women, we just perceive, or we portray ADHD symptoms without even realizing it, and it's in our brain. Our brain just can go a million miles per minute, and I mean, for me, I was going a million miles per minute in my brain on my surface, and then my kids would touch me, and I'd be touched out, and then, I'd have all these plates spinning, and all of a sudden I'm just crashing, and come to find out it was ADHD the whole time, and that would have made my life so much easier 10 years ago had I known that. Um, but I don't know, like, I think that has been a huge relief, is like, I feel like a basket right now, and I need to get back to grounding, and being okay with that, and telling myself I'm okay with that, even if I may not be okay with it in that moment. I needed to be okay with it because I needed to keep going.
So what I'm hearing is that you really have learned what good support is.
Yeah.
And then you bring it into the workplace, into the HR field, and into the government, and do what you can to create support, change, and be the best you can be.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I did a presentation back in December for local governments in Alaska, and it was about the difference between HR management and personnel management. Personnel management more comes out of the European culture, but
Uh-huh.
it's the same concept. And personnel management is a pass through, paper pass through. There's no strategy behind it. I'm processing a promotion. I'm telling you that this is the rule. I'm telling a manager he can or cannot do that, or she can or cannot do that. And that's really what personnel management is. It's just a structure of confinement in a sense, in that sense. HRM, now what we're seeing with the city, by utilizing HRM practices and getting the right people at the table, we're developing plans for the entirety of the process. So we're going through right now a big reorg, and it's unheard of. Like before, we were, HR wasn't a part. This is just a basic, the difference. So before, a decision was made to add a position. Well, this position was just added to the pay scale. There was no comp study done. There was no job description at that point. There was no thought process between where this person will work, who they will report to, what does this look like. And then a year later, we're like, the person who did this was like, oh my gosh, this isn't working, and blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, yep, makes sense. That makes sense. We're getting there. But now we have a comprehensive plan. We're doing the same thing, but I've had 4 meetings to lead up to this, and I have 3 different big key people, and then we have another meeting lined up to say, what does that look like, and who needs support, and where is that support needed? And so instead of just looking at the small piece, we're looking at the entire picture. And what's that going to do? It's going to make the transition for that specific employee who's impacted a lot smoother. We're not going to get everything. We're going to try to, but we're not going to get everything. It's hoping, wishful thinking, whatever. But at least we're looking at the huge overarching aspect, and it's HR that's bringing in those department people because they have their own operations, each of them, and they're overwhelmed and they have their job. So it's my job to bring it together and say, okay, we need to talk about this. Even though you have all these other 100 things, I will manage it. You talk about it, and we will come up with a plan, and I will ensure that it happens. Like that. That's my role.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. You have come a long ways from the place where you began, and you're really taking on a leadership role and, putting yourself out there. And there goes my construction in my house. But anyways, it's something that I love this, because the other thing that I wanted to comment on is because of your openness and your fearless, or I should say courageous openness, is that you have a journey and a healing journey that I would believe that you're better at your role, because you probably think somewhere inside of you that you never know where somebody's coming from.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is what's really good about the trauma that I had and that I've overcome is that, yes, it puts me in the same perspective. I've experienced so many different things, a vast variety of things, not in a, arrogant way, but in a way that I've had to work through them. That when I have an employee on the other side who's experiencing a very hurtful feeling
Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
situation, I know that I've felt that, or I have put myself into that position, so I could at least empathize with them, and I understand where they're coming from, and I have that ability to listen to what they're saying, and then I try to maneuver the situation to make it a little less painful, even if it's not going to be completely painless. We could at least try to manage it, and then everybody feels respected in the end. And there's a lot to be respected. There's a
I
lot
love
with
this.
that respect. And
I
so
really love it because you're there, and plus you've gone through
mhm,
getting support for what you need, and I love
right.
it.
And I think
So,
that there's also a balance, of course. I've had to
yeah,
learn that balance in this role
right.
because there is a balance required for HR to have a business mindset. So I've learned that along the way,
Yep.
because I was a total empath, but I'm learning that balance, and I've learned a lot. So that also is hard too, because it's like, oh no, I really want to help this person be able to get paid the whole time that they're off on FMLA. But there are limitations, in a
Right,
business
right.
level. So how can I respectfully relay that?
Yeah. So I love this conversation, and I could talk to you forever, but I need to wrap because
Mhm.
we're almost at an hour here. And we can go on and on and on, which we'll have many more conversations. But what would you leave our listeners with, as far as, because you've gone through a journey and that are their own unique emotional dilemmas, that are psychological and spiritual. what would you leave people with that they're listening or may re-listen to this?
I think finding what works for them. Therapy is not the answer for everybody, but maybe it is picking up the phone and calling the confident that you really, really enjoy their conversation. Maybe it's going for a walk. Maybe it's being that change maker. And for me, I love to see when people are positively impacted by my boldness. And sometimes my boldness is not accepted, and that's okay. And I sometimes have to, I'm learning now in my 30s to maneuver that boldness in a way that works for whatever I'm in. But I think that if you feel like a victim, it's okay to feel that too. But how do you get past it? That's the biggest piece, in my opinion, that I've had to learn is, okay, but what's the next step? And it's not always what's in front of me, but what is that 30 yards down the line? Where am I going? And it's going to take time to get there. It's not just an overnight thing. I mean, here I am 15 years later, and I feel like I'm just now healing again. Um, so I mean, it's a journey and it never ends, and it's frustrating and happy and great and upsetting all at the same time. But, everybody has their journeys and everybody can help each other.
I love that. I love that. And you haven't let it stop you from doing fabulous things in our world and in the city of Wasilla. And I'm sure you're going to do some great things in the state of Alaska. But Jaymie, I thank you for being here and sharing your fabulous story with open courage. And I applaud you because I think you're awesome. And I think that it's fabulous that you feel that safe and open to just share. Thank you so much. And I'm going to meet you backstage. So thank you, anybody out there. Thank you so much. I'm going to end this podcast, but thank you so much, Jaymie.
Thank you, Christine.